Tonight's speaker is one of our own, Dr. Ashley Poust, the Nat's James R. Colclough Paleontology Postdoctoral Researcher. There's a tongue twister, Ash. Ashley is the museum's first paleontology postdoctoral fellow, a position that was established in honor of James R. Colclough. A California native, Ash was able to return to the state to earn a Ph.D. from University of California, Berkeley, go Bears, before moving to San Diego. And when he's not working, he prefers to lose himself in nature or in a book. He'll talk more about his research, but broadly speaking, he focuses on fossil vertebrates and uses techniques such as bone histology and phylogenetics to investigate major adaptations in the history of life. Ash is a talented communicator. I think if you haven't seen the NPR story he was featured in, or any of the NPR stories he's been featured in, you definitely will want to check those out. And so we're all in for a treat tonight. Welcome, Ash.
Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I'm really excited to be here to talk about dinosaurs. And I know that this is a very common topic for the San Diego Natural History Museum, though we do have some of really important dinosaurs in our collections. It's not an area that's primarily known for that. And so this is sort of a treat, and you'll see some ways in which the work that I did with these colleagues on T-Rex and on these calculations actually feed back into a lot of what I'm doing here at the Nat. So I'm really excited. This has been a really wonderful and unique place to do this work, even if Tyrannosaurus Rex is not something that we have a lot of in our museum. You'll find that I generally spend a lot of time both in the collections and in my office just thinking about bone. And that is a consequence of being not just a paleohistologist, someone who studies the tissue structure of bone, usually under a microscope, but in general, just from being a vertebrate paleontologist. We often have primarily bone, if we're lucky, left to deal with from the assemblages and the rocks that we're able to look at. Now, sometimes you get really cool fossils like the tissues of eggshell, or even the traces of past behavior on the ground, like footprints or nests. But for the most part, the material that we're working with is little bits of scrappy bone, and we'll see some of those in a minute. So why would I, someone who spends all my time looking at little bits of bones, try to count up all of the past organisms that have lived, and why would we specifically choose T-Rex to attempt that? Well, T-Rex is really cool, and I think that that's where we'll start. Why a Rex census? And then we'll spend a fair amount of the talk walking through what we actually did and how we did it and what we found. I'll kind of interweave those two things, as it was sort of an iterative process. We'd find something new as we went to the next step in the calculation. And then I'd like to close by spending some time providing a map for understanding the past, and I'll get to what I mean by that. Just one map, but hopefully a useful one. So I'd like to start with this question. You know, you saw my title, how rare is rare, right? What does it mean to be rare? And what are we thinking about when we ask a question like that? This really connects to the way that we conceive of objects and the value that we place on them. And so I think it's interesting to pick an example of something that seems superficially similar, but in the end is fairly different. So what is on the screen in front of you? Well, it's one of the more collectible items in the world, which are coins. There's coin collectors. There's even a word for someone who's a coin collector, a numismatist. I can't even say it. That's how niche this is, but it's a widespread hobby. And you may have collected coins yourself as a child, or even continue to do so now. If you did, you might recognize this coin, because this is one of the most sought after coins, and certainly the rarest and most valuable coin in US history. And this is the 1933 double eagle, and it was minted in gold. And there were something like 445,000 of them minted. But for a number of reasons, the largest one of which was 33, the gold standard was something that we went off of very quickly in President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's term as president. And under those circumstances, these coins were actually recalled partly by a federal act. And so it was illegal to even own most of the stampings of this of this coin, and they were all gathered up back by the federal government and melted back down, ultimately for use as a currency for the war effort. So of those nearly 500,000 1933 double eagle coins that were printed, there are 13 that are known to still exist. And most recently, one of the ones in private hands was sold for $18.8 million. So why are we talking about coins? Well, it's the concept of rarity. So it is the same idea of rarity equate to something from the fossil record. At Tyrannosaurus rex, for example, here's the famous Sioux, which legendarily sold for somewhere north of $9 million, ultimately to the Field Museum of Chicago, but through the funding combined of McDonald's and the Disney Corporation. Sioux was partly prepared at the Field Museum in Chicago and partly prepared, as in dug out of the rock, in front of people at Disneyland, or Disney World, I guess, in Florida. So if T-Rex, and you'll see, equates to being almost exactly as rare as these 1933 double eagles, if you correct for the number that are known and how rare they may have been, in their initial production line, which is the answer we're eventually trying to get to with T-Rex, right? How many have ever were? Then the amount of evaluation turns out to be not that different. Tyrannosaurus rex is a little less rare than a 1933 gold double eagle, and it turns out to have sold for a little less. So the question is that an appropriate way of thinking about rarity? And I would put it to you that there are two different things that are tied up here that we should be careful to separate out. And the main thing here is that rarity doesn't equal value. So when I go on the rest of the talk to talk about the absolute preservation rate, the reason we kind of use that term is multitudinous. There's a lot of reasons why we use that term rather than just rarity, but one of the biggest ones is, I think in people's minds, we associate it immediately with value. And I just have one way of putting it to you, that it probably is not the same thing, even though rare things are often valuable. And that's, you can be pretty unique and still not be worth very much in many people's eyes. I mean, the restoration of this famous painting, Echo Homo, is definitely not what I would call valuable, but it's certainly unique. So when we think about this idea of how well preserved things are, as a paleontologist, this gets me back to this generalized question of how good is the fossil record? And people often have recourse to Darwin. There's a lot of good reasons for that. But there's one case in which there was some stuff that Darwin just didn't know. And there's actually many cases because he lived, quite a long time ago. But one of those is in regards to the fossil record, which was sort of a real problem for Darwin. Darwin posited that there would be these, graduated changes that surmounted to what we think about now as evolution. And he wasn't necessarily seeing those transitional forms in all cases, even in the fossil record where you would like them to be preserved. And so he tried really, really hard in the 9th chapter of the original edition of Origin of Species to be very honest and just say, look, fossil record is not good. It doesn't preserve these things. Now, thankfully for him and other scientists, Archaeopteryx, the famous, quote, transitional dinosaur-like bird or bird-like dinosaur, was found in Germany only a couple of years after the initial publication of the Origin of Species. But he still, in the original edition, was able to say, now let us turn to our richest geological museums, and what a paltry display we behold. And I think it's funny for me reading this statement because it just couldn't seem any more different to me now. There is another way of rarity. It's not just that we're missing big sections of history of life, it's also that the scale we look at things, it varies wildly. So you might say, look at the top here, a single measured section, A, and say, oh, well, this is what happened through time. But if you look across a single basin, you're missing some holes in the history of that area. And yet other things may be represented, a mile away that weren't in your initial measured section. And the same thing is true with regional variation. If you look all the way from New Zealand to New Jersey, you might get some facies, some rock types, some part of the history of Earth that absolutely wasn't represented in New Zealand, now is present in New Jersey. But then there's all kinds of gaps in between that are now introduced that didn't exist at the smaller local scale. So even if you can think about the quality of the fossil record, it's not just a global issue. It really is how are the holes scaling differently. And that's all just to say, in spite of all those problems, the fossil record is really incredibly good. And it blows my mind consistently, even knowing that there's a huge percentage of the species that ever lived on Earth that we'll never know, or that we certainly don't know now. The quality of individual fossils and the quality of the overall picture seems startlingly incredible to me. And here's just two examples from my own work. One is that on the left, this pink shape you see here is super, super close-up image under a microscope of dinosaur bone. And that's the original mineralized dinosaur bone that's visible. You can see the original blood vessels of these shapes. The T-shaped one in the middle is this passageway of the blood vessels coming in and out. And the little strawberry seed-like shapes are the actual places where bone cells would have resided in the bone itself. And of course, there's work by other authors showing that some of the original chemical remains, or even some of the parts of the cells themselves, may have been preserved. And then on the right, at the scale of individual organisms, we have a fairly decent dinosaur. This is sort of the hips, legs, and tail of a dinosaur. And as we were looking at this dinosaur from China, we realized it had preserved eggs, not just with it, but in the pelvic canal. So this is a dinosaur that died while it was gravid with eggs, while essentially a pregnant dinosaur had yet to lay them. And we were able to then infer all kinds of amazing things about dinosaur reproduction that were captured by this one single fossil. A good way of seeing how incredibly amazing the fossil record is and how incredible scientists are at pulling this data out of an intractable and difficult book is recent work on the fossil record. And we're talking the last year and a half, okay? Like as we were getting our science paper in revisions, these are the papers that came out. Carr in 2021 looked at, it's like a 80-page paper. He looked at every single fossil that's in a public institution and looked at it in an ontogenetic context, that is where it was in the individual animal's lifespan. And he was able to interpret how Tyrannosaurus rex changed, not just through the geological record, but through its own life as it aged and grew up. On a different scale, but to the same question of dinosaur growth, my friend Holly and a bunch of colleagues actually cut up juvenile dinosaurs, famous specimens from Cleveland and from the Burpee Museum in Illinois. And they were able to get incredibly gorgeous images of the bone histology and then interpret how the animal was growing and exactly how old each of these specimens was, and demonstrate that in their view, there weren't other miniature visions of T-Rex running around other than their own young, sort of falsifying the idea that Nanotyrannus was a separate organism, or likely to be. Just as our paper was coming out, Alan Titus published a paper showing that Tyrannosaur relatives were actually almost certainly moving around in packs some of the time. Were they just meeting up to feed, or were they moving around like intelligent herds? We really don't know yet. But it's pretty incredible how this careful work at one site is able to show that these dinosaurs really did live at the same time and were all killed in a single flood event. They even used rare earth elements, the very, very uncommon heavy elements from the periodic table, to demonstrate that the water flow was all the same for each of these organisms after they died. So pulling these pieces out like Sherlock Holmes to say what had happened in the past, we're able to learn incredible things from a fossil record. And last but not least, a study came out in Science also about the same time as ours with a really cool result, which was, if you look at Africa or any other major area today, you can see that major predators are overlapped or close in size to the next predator down. And so if you keep going down, you have carnivorous animals that are smaller and 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 smaller until you get down to little teeny cute kit foxes. And then maybe that even smaller niches are taken over by birds or insects. And if you look at periods where Tyrannosaurus rex or its relatives existed, that's not the picture of size range you get at all. You get carnivorous T-Rex, and then the next things are super tiny, maybe not even fully carnivorous. So what's going on? And the answer is, we think that the young of a mammal, which is cared for by its parents and even fed essentially through their parents' body by lactation, by drinking milk, is very, very different from how the life history of the young of a Tyrannosaur would have worked, which is, even if you get some parental care, you got to find food on your own from day one. And so a baby Tyrannosaurus rex is essentially taking the place of a small predator, and a teenage Tyrannosaurus rex is taking the place of a mid-sized predator, and an adult T-Rex is taking the place of a large predator, and an old T-Rex is pushing the bounds of how big you can be while you're eating meat. And so they really sort of clear out this ecospace around them. And this was all very valuable information as we started to decide how are we going to investigate the question of how complete the fossil record is. Now, you might get the idea from all this amazing work that we just go out and brush off dinosaurs like the classic scene from Jurassic Park. But in reality, what we really see is this, if we're lucky. And so I'd love to encourage you, take a moment and see, can you find the T-Rex in this picture? All right, I hope you've had a chance to sort of attune your eye. This is pretty close up. You got to remember that most of us are standing, 5-6 feet above the Earth's surface and far away. And so even getting up close to this, it's not necessarily that easy, right? It's just a little bit of armchair field work for those of you who are missing being outdoors during COVID. But just to give you the answer, that circled tooth, Tyrannosaurus rex tooth in the middle is the classic thing you might have noticed. There's actual bone fragments all over in this picture, and they're just hiding amongst the iron-rich rocks of the Hell Creek Formation, where this is found in Montana. So we get to this question of, can we use Tyrannosaurus rex to gauge how good the fossil record is, and why would we choose T-Rex? Well, I kind of gave away one of the answers there. But one of the first questions is, we're going to use T-Rex because, frankly, just because of all the attention that it has had. So Tyrannosaurus rex is really well known, and that means that all those studies that we said, even in just the last year, that have come out, can be used to inform, to flesh out the information that we need to answer our questions. So once we had realized this was actually the attention that T-Rex gets led to it being studied a lot, which was very useful to us, we needed to ask the question of, well, how many have been found? Is this even a possible thing for us to evaluate? For most of my childhood, there was like 5 T-Rex known, but a concentrated effort to discover many more over the last few decades has led to a much better number. And just since I already gave it away, the number is about 50 T-Rex. But what we don't know is 50 out of how many, right? So if we want to get just that sheer number of rarity, which remember, I'm not conflating with value, but sheer number of rarity is really important because it gives us an idea of the biology of T-Rex, how many ever were living and what that might look like on the landscape, and also the quality of the fossil record. How many out of that original number are being preserved? We know the answer is something like 50 so far, but we don't know what percentage that is. So we need to figure out that other number. How could we do that? So that brings us to the actual study itself, what we did and what we found. I was lucky enough to work with an incredible group of people from Montana. It was led by my old advisor at Berkeley, Charles Marshall, and the authors of this study were all Berkeley students, actually. So this is a really fun communal group there in California to work on and connect back with the people that I'd worked with in Montana on all those previous dinosaur studies. And under Charles' leadership, we developed this complicated framework. Each of the things in the purplish blue and the yellow are inputs. These are things we needed to know in order to get to the green, which are the outputs. Now, if this looks complicated, don't worry about the specifics. The point is that there are a lot of inputs with the number of outputs. And we'll walk through it. Basically, what we needed to know was how common was T-Rex at one time, and then ultimately, how long did it rule the Earth? Because if you know how many T-Rex were around at any given second, and then you know how long T-Rex was around for and something about its life, then you can calculate how many there ever were. And so along the way, we wanted to learn ultimately the big one, right? How rare. But that also required us to know how many were alive at one time and the number of T-Rex that ever lived. So I'm going to give you each of those answers, and I think I've set it up so that when you see Daniel Defoe's awesome reconstruction of the T-Rex skeleton here, you should be getting one of those answers. Just to make it easier too, because that figure from our science paper is super intimidating and not very easy to read on our screens here. I've also worked with my friend Sarah Volz, who's an amazing she actually works in biophysics, working on molecules and how they react to tensile forces, which then gives her information about the strength of the bonds and the type of arrangement of these molecules. So she's working on really high level stuff, but in her off time, she helps me do amazing cartoons. So she's also our Dungeons and Dragons dungeon master. So she's a very creative person. But this, I think, gets across one of the most central and most important ideas, of the input side of our paper, and that is amongst living animals, based on hard data from living animals, we know that there's a strong, clear relationship between body mass, the size of an animal on land, and the number of them that can live in any square amount of area. So a easy way of saying that is you can fit a heck of a lot of rabbits in the same number of square miles that you need to support an elephant. And this ultimately comes down, you may see me use this term or hear me use this term, Dameth's law. The scientist who really did the work to collect all of this information and create graphs like this is who we named the law after. And it basically gives a strong relationship like this. And you can make it even better if you subdivide the information by the energy that the animal needs to sustain itself. So we can split this up into mammals, into herbivores and carnivores, et cetera. And so our answer for T-Rex, it's a really big animal, right? And we have looked at all the previous research that people did on the mass of the animal in order to get a sense of where it sits on that graph. So even taking into account all the possible ranges for how heavy T-Rex would have been, we know that it's really, really big. And that means it would have been really, really uncommon on the landscape. The next thing we need to know is what square area is. Well, so if it's uncommon, well, you can only fit 1 in 10 square miles, and there's 10 square miles, then there's 1. But that doesn't make sense. So how much space was T-Rex occupying? And here's where we need to do some pretty complicated modeling. We were really lucky that another scientist, Chiarenza, just published a paper on the ecosystem arrangement of North America during the time of the latest living non-avian dinosaurs, right before the extinction of most of the dinosaurs. So this may look like an unfamiliar shape to you, but if the part poking down on the left is essentially Baja California. And the blurb going up into the middle is actually an extended seaway coming out of the Gulf of Mexico. So this does represent North America with a bridge over in Beringia into Asia. And so using this, we're able to get upper and lower bounds on the number of square miles that Tyrannosaurus rex might have lived in, both like a conservative estimate based around where we found T-Rexes so far, and we can constrain them very tightly, and a large estimate based on where it might have lived, which essentially means it would have ranged at least from Alaska to Baja California. So our minimum estimate of geographic range is still very large. It's like 1.5 million square kilometers. So going back to our graph here, we can use that, we can map our way through for this neontological information. We recognize this as Dameth's information here, and adding that to all of our spatial information, the ecological body mass and the geographic range, we can get to the number that are alive at any given one time. And that's something like 20,000. Now that is a very small number. If you think about 20,000 is tiny. I mean, the number of people living in San Diego is many, many times that, right? But this is also a very big, scary animal. And this is largely in keeping with the density and the overall number of tigers living in the wild today, if you just upsize the tiger by a fair amount. So that answers our main question. How common was T-Rex at one time? And all we need to know now is something about its life history and about how long it was around. And so what we need to do that is understand the number of generations that T-Rex was on Earth. Here's another awesome cartoon, just sort of showing a family tree of Tyrannosaurus. And that has 2 parts to it as well. How long was one generation? How long did it take for the kids to grow up and have kids of their own? And then how much time was their absolute time for those generations to occur in? So that's generation time and absolute years of existence. So how do we learn about the life history of a dinosaur? How do we figure out how long it takes T-Rex to grow up? Well, there we go back to the work that I've done on bone histology and that people like Holly have taken forward with Tyrannosaurus rex itself. So here's a maybe brutal picture for those of you who love fossils, but for me, it's a very exciting picture. This is the picture I took of the dinosaur that I named last year, Wulong, very small feathered dinosaur from China. But I took this after I used a tiny diamond-edged saw to chop out part of its shin bone. And I took this back with me to the lab, and I was able to mount that on a glass slide, grind it down, and look at it. So this is that fossil bone histology that I've been mentioning, and you get a result. This is from a different animal, but that looks something like this. And when you zoom in, you're able to see those same incredible structures that I mentioned earlier in the talk. One of the things you can get from that that's really wonderful is estimates of age. And when combined with our knowledge of fossil assemblages, the really fine scale work that I mentioned, like that which had showed us that some tyrannosaurs actually lived together, by mapping and carefully understanding the geology, we can combine that to get a good sense of family life histories, individual life histories, and the generation time of an animal like T-Rex. So this requires collecting good information in the field, something we'll come back to as well. So that's an individual dinosaur life, but how do we get to that whole species? Well, that's the number of generations. So that for that, we need geologic time. Yet another thing where the field becomes important. So this is I like this project a lot because we started off and we were sitting around in Berkeley and we were saying, how do we understand the fossil record? Can we use a single organism to model it? And then from there, our project was mostly math. But every time we would need an input into this math equation, we couldn't just make up an answer, right? We had to go back to the very careful work that scientists had done in museums like the Nat and in field locations like those that field scientists go to. And so we had to look at some awesome rocks. I was lucky enough to actually get out into the Hell Creek Formation, which is the cool sounding name of the rock unit where T-Rex is found in Montana. This is close up to the Fort Peck Reservoir, an area which is like 110 degrees these days. From that and a bunch of published work, we're able to get a plausible longevity for the species of T-Rex, not just an individual. So if an individual T-Rex lives for 30 years and takes a little bit less than that, something like 15, 13, to reproduce the next generation, then we have to divide that number into something like 2.5 million years. That gives us a good idea then of how many generations of T-Rex would have existed. Combining that back with the number of 20,000 that are all around the same time, we get our answer for the number that ever lived, and it's 2.5 billion, which is a heck of a number. And I love this number for two reasons, at least, which is it seems really big and it seems really small. So it seems really big, like billion is an inconceivably large number. And if you think this is over millions of years, it just gives you an idea of Tyrannosaurus rex as this force on Earth, just out there haunting the plains and maybe the mountains for an interminable amount of time and distance. And it's just such a big, cool number. It's also very small. 2.5 billion, that's over millions and millions of years. You know, these guys would have been little rare monsters, maybe in a far off sound. They would have moved around over a huge range, at least some of the time, and in order to find the food that they needed. And maybe you would never have even encountered one if you went on a safari in the Cretaceous. 2.5 billion is a large number, but remember, again, so that's split up over its entire existence. There are 3 times that many humans living at this second. Museum specimens become really, really important when we're examining this because they give us our final answer. So if 2.5 billion, that's the number that ever lived. But remember, our original goal was how good is the fossil record done at giving us the evidence of that? Do you remember, does anyone remember the number that we were working with? Give me a drum roll. Yeah, 50, right? So 50 and 2.5 billion, there's a couple of bits of rounding that we do, and we can come up with a pretty good estimate that only 1 out of every 80 million Tyrannosaurus rex that ever lived is currently available to see in a museum. That's pretty rare. 1 in 80 million, that's pretty much lotto level chances. So if you're a T-Rex and you're alive, you have about as much a chance of winning the lottery as you do if they had a lottery back then as being preserved. Now, I get asked the question sometimes, how sure of this are we? This sounds like a lot of estimation, I get asked. I think that that's true, and we really acknowledge that very clearly in the paper. This is a big graph, but if you zoom in on any one specific one, we'll do total number of individuals, which if you'll remember is our 2.5 billion number. This little graphic of all the little, looks like cell phone towers, those are our modeled answers around the actual answer that we ended up with. So we have a trail of uncertainty. We think our chances are that we're wrong, that goes off on either side out to a certain percentile. And so we have a pretty big range of error we're able to show in the paper. We might be off by many times for the total number that ever lived or the area that they lived in, et cetera. And modeling that, I think, was something that we really felt was very important for the paper, not only because it's a scientific and we want these to be a dynamic set of answers. We don't think 2.5 billion is like the final answer. You find 10 more T-Rex and that number of 1 in 80 million will change. That's good. That means that we have created a system, a recipe for someone to follow to say, well, as you get more information or you constrain these answers better, we can get a clearer idea of these questions that we've asked. There's another cool reason, though, why the error was actually a really fun part of this paper, which is it lets us know which part of the calculation is the least convincing, which part is the least certain. And the coolest part turns out to be, if anyone wants to venture a guess, I bet you'll be wrong, because it isn't any of the fossil data. Really, we want to say it's 1 out of 80 million plus or minus. I think that's important. But where does that plus or minus mostly come from? What's contributing the most to it? It's actually the extant data. So if we were able to go out and learn more about either from the shallow fossil record or even just from understanding how living organisms are distributed on the landscape and how their energetics and their feeding works, we would get a better idea of T-Rex, because most of the slop, most of the uncertainty in our calculation actually comes from those day-myth curves, as good and convincing as they are. It's kind of a cool answer. So now that you've got the big reveal, that T-Rex was, 2.5 billion that ever lived, and 20,000 some roaming around North America, the western part of North America at the time. Where do we go from here? Why am I talking about this as a postdoc at the NAT? So what I want to kind of frame this as building a map from a recipe. So if you remember that image that I showed you of our complicated figure that showed each of the inputs and each of the outputs and what we modeled for each of them, that's a recipe, right? You could put new information into that calculation and get a different answer out, right? It's a pipeline. But I also like to think of it in some ways as a map of the country. So there's so much of the biology and of the paleontology that went into generating those answers, that got into pulling those what we call paleobiological data points out of the fossil record, that I think we can use the overall step back and look at what's there as a way of pushing our research in totally other areas. So one of the best things about being at the NAT is that the strengths of where I am now and the things I get to work on are really different from where I started when I was in Montana or even when I was in Berkeley. We have one of the best records in the world, bar none, of the more recent marine mammal and marine vertebrate record. We have the San Diego Formation, which underlies the museum and a bunch of other important parts, even parts of downtown in our pretty city, is replete, filled with fossils. Every time there's a big dig a library, dig some part of the zoo, and Tom Demaray and the others at the NAT will be finding these whale fossils. And we have an incredible display at the NAT you can check out yourself. But how do we possibly use the T-Rex data to look at that? Well, there's some challenges, and I would point out two. One is, I'm not really sure how all this stuff works in the ocean. So I think there's going to be an additional step, which I haven't quite figured out yet, but if you guys have ideas, you should let me know, about how we can get away from just the sheer area and about the amount of energy that's present in that area. So that'll be something really fun to work on in the future. But there's an even more fundamental problem, which is that, remember, we chose Tyrannosaurus rex because it was so popular and so widespread and had been known for 100 years, and it was featured in movies. And because of all that, people loved it, and they did all these amazing studies of it. Well, there just aren't that many big studies on sailfish or toothless walruses from Chula Vista. Now, how do we cope with that problem? Well, hopefully in this paper, if you look at it like a map, we've created a way of getting there, even if you're going a different direction. So some of the first sort of global scale maps were these different pathways people took to bring silk from the coast of China, where the silkworms and the production of silk was traditional, that over to the Middle East, where they were traded for, mostly in Iran and then later in Turkey and Italy. And the Silk Road, as it came to be developed in the time of ancient Rome, was a world-spanning endeavor. But initially, it was just people in the trackless desert. And so I like to think in some ways, and this is maybe a over-the-top comparison, but that this little T-Rex paper, even though it's just about silk, it's just about one particular trade item, can eventually help us to get an idea of all the countries around and where we might go if we want to trade something else, whether that's pepper or fine china or camels. So going back to this and sort of stepping back, each one of these inputs is something important that someone else in the fossil record has, or someone else in paleontology has pulled out of the fossil record to inform us about the biology of these animals. And so using our same little cartoons, I'd like to just point out a couple of these that we're working on right now in the NAT, different sections of the NAT. So the life history box that we use to interpret how long T-Rex would live, we can do that for other animals because they all share this common origin of bone. Remember why bone? Well, partly bone because it's such a great window into the lives of almost all vertebrates. Here we have a little predator's bone, and we can see that it has these strong lines. Also, the blood vessels you can see and the bone cells are still, the preservation is amazing, but these strong lines are like the lines of a tree, and they can help us understand that these animals are actually growing slower than their living carnivorous relatives. We can apply this to our toothless walrus, our Balanictus, which is our famous Chula Vista fossil, and we can learn things about it that people weren't sure of before, which is that its bones are wildly dense. And so we're studying these bones to try to understand its adaptations for suction feeding and being in the water column so that it can control its buoyancy using its skeleton. We can look at the earliest whales and more recent whales and see how their growth has changed through time. But we can find out amazing things like even early whales were already living much longer lives and growing more slowly, like our extant giant companions. So that age difference, that life history difference may have preceded the achievement of gigantic humpback whale, blue whale sizes. Another thing that's really cool is that fine scale work we talked about doing good work in the field, being a responsible data collector and scientist in a quarry. And if you're going to pick a place in the world that does that, this is one of the places to pick. We have the Paleo Services division of the NAT that covers in particular the mitigation, the salvage of fossils from major construction zones. And I love this photo of our crew members working at the State Route 11 big project down the new entryway in and out of Mexico. The highway that turns off there went through rocks from the Miocene age, some 15 million year old, 20 million year old rocks. And they uncovered an incredible treasure trove of fossils, everything from ancient predatory dogs to camels, which used to live in North America. And the work that's been done to collect and map it in place, especially our primary preparator and lab technician, Chris Poust's work to do fine scale mapping of the specimens, and then the incredible work that's being done to when the jackets of specimens are brought back to the museum to observe and not just rip them out and put them on display, but to really understand the context and the relationship of each bone to each other by people like Tom and Amanda is just an incredible approach and a really fruitful approach to paleontology that can lead to us understanding things like the diet of those dogs or the herding habitat of the camels that may or may not have moved in groups, which then could feed back into similar studies like our T-Rex study to understand these big paleobiological questions of life through time. And one last project that I really like that we're working on that's hopefully coming to fruition very soon really covers a number of bases. This is a specimen that turns out to be the blade cutting teeth of a cat-like, but not cat, saber-toothed fossil from here in San Diego. And I have up in the corner the little picture of sort of biogeography, right? When we were trying to model all of the different climate regimes that Tyrannosaurus rex could live in. How does this relate to that? Well, this is a time when we didn't know that there were these hypercarnivorous, that means very strongly focused on meat eating, pretty much unable to eat plants and fruit. We didn't know that there were these hypercarnivorous mammals yet living in North America. And so to find one as far down south as San Diego really gives us an incredible picture, not only of what San Diego was like at the time in a new way, but also what the patterns of life movement were and how the ecosystems and the types of behavior, the niches that these animals were living in actually would flow across the earth. And so this allows us, again, to understand these big pictures of the environment and of where animals are living. So if we want to expand on the T-Rex idea, we've got to develop these ideas. This stuff is well preserved enough, actually, it can give us a sense of the phylogenetic placement, that is where in the family tree this is. And so where you see right in about in the middle where it says SDSNH and then a number, that is our specimen. And so it plots really kind of far up this tree rather than down by the red thing, which is on the far left, Malphelus. That's a thing from Asia, and it's the earliest known of these false saber-toothed cats. And so it's pretty interesting. The second that it gets into North America, it's already changing and adapting and evolving new features. So it's not exactly like its origin. There's a big mystery to look at there. This also became a study, though, of geologic time and its stratigraphy, placement in the rocks, because this specimen turned out to be very old. There's a few fragments. You can see the, you kind of ignore the details, but in the yellow and the purple on the right-hand side are the only things, these like little broken teeth fragments that precede ours. Otherwise, ours is really as old as the oldest of these false saber-toothed cats that's ever been found. And so not only do we have changing our picture of North America, but in some ways we're changing our picture of where these meat-eating animals lived and how quickly they evolved. It also ends up being a body mass question because this is a fairly large animal, and we can map body mass onto this phylogeny and get a sense of how these animals are changing size and how big you can be while still eating meat, all of which are the same kind of data we used in the T-Rex equation. And so we're sort of slowly moving forward each of these pictures of many different organisms throughout the fossil record to try to get our understanding of the fossil record of vertebrates up to that Rex level. And I think it'll take a long time. I think there's many, as we say, millions of years of work to do at the NAT. I think the concept, though, is that as we push all these things forward, we'll be able to get closer and closer to being able to apply big models like the T-Rex assessment to huge swaths, maybe even whole ecosystems of life of the past. So I think in spite of this being just one little example, just the silk, just the T-Rex, we're able to sort of see light on the horizon for being able to answer questions we thought were previously really totally unanswerable. And I think that's a pretty exciting place to be. So with that, I thank both all of you for your attention and a few really essential people. Susumu was my partner on a lot of the carnivoran mammal work. Tom has been not only my immediate supervisor, but also a really great coworker on all of the work here at the NAT. And I wouldn't be here without the generosity of Jim Colclough and other people like him who support our museum. So thank you so much for your time. And I think there's quite a lot of time for questions, or clarifications. Thanks so much.